whatever one thinks of Seurat, and I both like him and have reservations about him and pointillism, which they called, by the way, the pointillists called themselves neo-impressionists. It was nonetheless a watershed moment, and it really unleashed this race towards modernism more than anything else that happened in 19th century France. And it's the initiator of this, Seurat, is a very curious character. He lives a very short life, and he's very introverted. Most of the connections he made with other artists were made through his partnership with Signac once they met and discovered how close they were and what they were trying to do. Signac was very sociable. Seurat was very private, and I think part of the reason he was so private is he came from a rather unusual family. His father was a property speculator who lived about 15 kilometers away from his family and just visited it once a week. He was the third child, the youngest, and initially was actually going to a sculptural academy, École Municipale de Sculpture. And then in 1878, at the age of 19, I think, yes, he decided he wanted to be a painter and attended the École des Beaux-Arts. He just attended for a year. Of course, he'd already had a lot of experience drawing at the Sculptural Academy, but he only really had 1 year of training as a painter. And then he had to do his obligatory military service for a year. When he gets out of military service in 1878, he takes a studio and shares it with a friend, and begins to do a little painting, though mostly what he will do for the first 2 years is draw. But here's one of his first little paintings on site, which is quite unusual because it's really about light and space and composition, and almost impossible to figure out what, in fact, the subject is. This was his studio partner, who ended up being a very traditional painter. But notice this is a drawing by Seurat of his partner, Amandin. And it's a type of drawing that he pioneered. And he was a student of art theory, color theory, compositional theory. He was almost, I would say he was almost a philosopher with a very strong mathematical tendencies, at the same time as being extremely sensitive. So he combines two almost opposite characteristics, though they were characteristics that were quite common in the Renaissance. And in some ways, he resembles someone like Piero del Francesco, who was both a wonderfully sensitive and brilliant artist, but also a brilliant mathematician. And so Seurat set about exploring painting from the fundamentals, beginning with drawing, trying to reinvent everything. And in these drawings, he believed, as the art theorists he was studying suggested, that beauty was the reconciliation of opposites in a painting. And here he's playing the opposite of black against the opposite of white. And he's using a technique which allows the white to show through. He's using a Conte crayon on handmade charcoal paper. Um, it's Conte crayon in those days was fabricated differently than now. Um, but he was at the same time that he was out to be the most modern of painters, dealing with modern subject matters. He had a great admiration for traditional painting. He'd done a number. He'd studied Raphael. He said he'd like he early on opined that he'd like his work to be like the frieze on the Pantheon. He had this very strong classical impulse. So he loved this artist. And what was interesting about Puvis de Chavannes, who we haven't really talked about, is that he was liked both by the traditional old school and by a lot of the contemporary artists, including actually Gauguin, who had copies of some of his work that he took with him to Tahiti. What's interesting here, this painting was shown around the time that Seurat began his drawings and his early paintings. And you see that in this little landscape, which if you look very closely has a cottage in it and some trees, he threw in his own sort of memory of Puvis de Chavannes for some reason. So it shows how connected he was with this artist. But this is more the kind of thing that he was doing. He does hundreds of these Conte drawings in which he's reducing everything to the simplest elements. And he's completely ignoring line as a design element and playing with light and shadow, playing the opposites of black against white, and creating some of the most original drawings that were done at that period, reducing things to bare essentials, bare compositional essentials.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You say he's completely ignoring line, and I can see how in terms of, like, the shapes, it's not like he's outlining shapes, but isn't line pretty important here?
Yeah, it is and it isn't. I mean, he's not outlining. In fact, he's mostly softening the transmission between edges. He's trying for atmosphere. He actually said, "What is this line? All I see are forms." So it's a pretty different way of approaching things. This is of his mother. He would also scrape to get back to pure white in some cases. But really, no one had ever done drawing quite like this before. It's quite radical. Um, and then he moves on to starting to explore after, in this 2-year period, he begins to explore painting. And you notice he's using a kind of broken brushwork that's a little like Impressionism, but he's going back and forth. He has verticals and he has horizontals. Again, the law of opposites is throughout his work, including the way you apply paint. He's applying the paint in two directions at once to create harmony. This is interesting because he's playing these little squiggles. He's just exploring what can be done with this very limited medium.
These are so cool. I've never seen these drawings before.
The drawings are cool, and there are hundreds of them. You can look them up. They're quite unusual. Years and years ago when I first started painting, I did a whole bunch of drawings trying to do like this. It ain't easy. So he moves from the drawings to very simple little oil sketches, some of which were done on site. I don't know if this one was. And he's working like the Impressionists before him, though this time he doesn't actually know the Impressionists. He's seen some of their work. He's working on the outskirts of Paris, which was still very rural and still had a peasant culture. And what's interesting about this one is you have a stonebreaker. And if you remember, Courbet, one of Courbet's first working class paintings at the beginning of his launching of realism was Stonebreakers. And it was a painting that really offended the Academy. And so he's obviously making a reference to Courbet, but he's working in an entirely different manner, in a very reductionist manner here. But now the opposites are not just the way he's applying the brush strokes, but also the colors. He's got this red, orange, and this blue. He's got the green, and he's got in places red running through it. He's exploring the opposition of color. You can see how these paintings are related in some way to his drawings too, in the way he creates them. Being very simple. This is stone breakers too, a husband and wife breaking stones. Though you wouldn't know it, you have to almost be told it. But again, a very interesting composition. So I returned to Puvis de Chavannes here because at about the time that this painting, well, when Puvis de Chavannes was starting on this painting, Seurat and his studio mate, Amajan, paid him a visit, and Puvis de Chavannes put them to work squaring off the canvas for this painting. And I can't stand this kind of painting. And in fact, Seurat, Lautrec couldn't either. And Lautrec actually painted a parody of this. He thought it was so silly. But someone like Seurat actually admired it for its classical harmony, which is something that he would aim at in his own much more modern work, which is why I introduce it here. So he starts out planning his first ambitious painting, and he does a bunch of little this is the location, and he starts going out there and painting and just observing what happens there to figure out what he's going to do with this location. And there are a number of these studies. There are probably about 30 of them. Here you see the background more clearly, and it's an area of Assignac which all the number of the Impressionist painters worked in this area because it was on the outskirts of the main part of Paris, on the edge of the industrial area. And he chooses to put the industrial landscape in the background of this painting. And there's a reason for that. He and Signac, who he would meet actually after he'd done this painting, but they both shared a kind of social optimism, which was beginning to, as France climbed out of the doldrums of the 1870s and the terrible disaster of the Franco-Prussian War, and the horrors of the slaughter after the Commune of Paris, was beginning to have a very optimistic view. And they saw the rising industry, which was raising the standard of living of many Parisians, as something that would continue. And many of them were anarchists and socialists. And they saw a new world built on industrialism as being possible. They rather ignored the affluence the wealth that was pouring into France and Paris from the empire, which was a major element. But anyway, so he just catches all the different things that are happening here. And then in the studio, he does more detailed studies of figures that he's decided on the poses and the people. So then he has people model for him to get more detail. And here's the final painting, which was refused by the Salon, naturally, and was shown. Just a second, let me see if I can find it here. It was shown in 1884, actually at the Impressionist exhibition, where it received really a lot of notice. Now you can see him adapting a lot of Impressionist practice here. The broken brushwork, the complementary colors, but he's also doing other things that hadn't really been done to the same extent before. And there is to the whole painting a quality of stillness and compositional clarity, which almost reaches back to the Renaissance. And actually, if you look at this painting and you diagram it, the proportions of this painting are about 4x7, well, 2x3, 4x6, which are close to the proportions of the golden mean. Does anyone understand the golden proportions? You've heard of it probably. Well,
Yeah, the spiral.
Yeah.
yeah, well, it creates the spiral. It's these two proportions though, this side and this side, that proportion of approximately 4:6 is a proportion that will replicate itself or break down consistently. Why? Because and I hope I can explain this so you can grasp it. It's very simple, but it's kind of hard to explain. If I take the long dimension here and I add it to the short dimension here, I then get this dimension here. And the long dimension becomes the short dimension. And so on. You can keep, so nature, the Greeks discovered this proportion. Nature uses this proportion to grow, which is why we see the spiral in the sunflower. But it's all over the place in nature. It's a fundamental building proportion. And artists in the Greek times and also in the Renaissance, when it was rediscovered, used it to construct the composition of their paintings, especially people like Piero della Francesca. But you can see it's in action here in terms of when you put these proportions in, you break down the larger proportions into the smaller proportions in the painting. You can see that things have been composed, not exactly, but quite closely to the golden mean proportions. Because being the logical, philosophical, mathematical person that he was, he felt that behind everything in art there was science, and that one should utilize this. And no artist had done this. No artist in the modern era had done it to the same degree as he chose to do it. So he immediately embarks. This is a study, by the way. This is not Le Grand Jean. This is a study for it. He's embarking on a second, even more ambitious painting. And he's also breaking up his brushwork, even in the study, considerably more. It was at this time, though, it was actually during the show of the other painting at the Impressionist exhibition, the Bathers, that he meets Signac. And I need at this point to introduce Signac. Signac was 5 years younger than him. Signac had actually trained as a architect. And then in 1880, he's actually in a bank where they have some of Monet's paintings, and he's blown away. He's never seen Monet before. And just like that, he decides, I don't want to be an architect. I want to be a painter. And obviously a highly motivated, very smart person, he sets out to make himself a painter. This is one of his early efforts, which shows the influence of the other. Now, he's very different than Seurat. He's very sociable. Very quickly, he gets to know the other Impressionists, the Barbizon painters. And you can see that this is somewhere between Le Barbizon and the early Impressionist painters. It's a coastal scene because he loved the ocean. He quite early on bought a small boat and started sailing the Mediterranean from one end to the other and painting all the ports in the Mediterranean. He also buys a little house in Saint-Tropez. He's the first person to be interested in Saint-Tropez. Later on, it becomes an artist center, but he's way ahead of the crowd. I should say one or two things about him, his background. He comes from a middle-class background, and the family lived in Montmartre. So quite from early on, he was encountered a lot of art and artists. When his father died, his father was a master harness maker. The mother, the business was sold, giving them means, and the mother relocated to Assanières. And it was, but he continued painting, and he would divide his time between Montmartre and his family home, because he didn't want to miss all the artistic life in Montmartre, but he painted in both areas. Now, as he gets to know Seurat better, he develops a style much closer to Seurat, as you can see it here. He also encourages Seurat to go all the way with pointillism in the afternoon on the Grand Jacques, Sunday afternoon on the Grand Jacques. And we'll see that in a minute. But Seurat, meanwhile, and by the way, when I change artists, I put their name underneath, just to know that we change from one artist to the other. Seurat, in the summers between working on his very ambitious paintings, would travel to the Atlantic, the northern coast of France, and paint in one of the ports. These paintings took a long time, so he would, in several weeks, he'd do maybe 2 or 3 paintings. I love this one because it actually reminds me of the southern coast of England. And some of these coastal ones are quite beautiful and a little reminiscent of Monet. Now, you can see, I think at this point, well, no, I'll get into the color theory a little later. This is the 1886. He spent 2 years working on this, and you can imagine with all these dots, it took a long time. This is Sunday afternoon of the Grand Jacques, which was when it was shown actually in a new exhibition that he and Signac and some other artists created. They felt like it was shown in the last Impressionist exhibition over the objections of Degas and Eugene Manet. But it was also shown in a new organization which the two of them created, which was called the Société des Artistes Indépendants. And actually, later Signac would become the manager of that society until his death, actually, in 1953, I think. 1937, I believe. But like the bathers, he's representing the different classes on the edge of the Seine, all enjoying their weekends together. And there's lots of for someone who knew Paris at the time, there are all kinds of references in this to fashion, to the different social classes. This guy is obviously not the same social class as these people. I mean, this woman even has her own little pet monkey down here. it does not come across in reproduction, because pointillism, if you can't see those, if your eye can't pick up all the different colored dots, which are everywhere, you're not going to get that vibration that comes off the original work. But it also has a very staged and almost caricature. Well, it has an artificial quality to it, and I don't know, what do you think of it?
I would always go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems with pointillism, is that you kind of were tied down to whatever design you created in the beginning.
Right.
And there was a certain inflexibility about the style, but it's a very interesting work.
I've always loved everything. Everything, there's always there's a shape represented in every person. Everything is very like geometric.
Yes,
And being so pointillism and so abstract with the way he's,
exactly.
but it's still got this very geometric shape. Everything's like, there's a woman with the white, so there's like a white circle on the left side with this like kind of red.
Yes,
Right.
yeah,
That's like very furniture. It feels like, just your eye is drawn there, but it just seems, everything seems so geometric to me. It's like, even
right. And then there are these mysterious little
yeah,
things coming in here. What in the heck are they? No, I mean, he's really, he's doing things with painting very methodically that might have happened by accident in previous paintings, but were never pushed this far. The geometry, the handling of paint, the pushing of color, all of this is new. He's almost reinventing painting from the ground up.
yeah. And even I mean, they've been looking at it now, like I was just pointing, I've obviously, since like Ferris Bueller, you sort of were aware of this painting. But just realizing the shadow and light, it's like, it's so obvious now than just the painting. Now I'm like seeing the shadow, I'm seeing the light, everything in darkness and blue.
Yeah.
So everything's got, like you said, the color represents the, like the blue, there's blue in the shadows. So it's very cool.
It's always seemed to me like it's so much about sort of the mechanism, the technique. And
Oh, it is. It is.
I'm not much of a fan of the result. It is so staged and almost plastic looking. And it just
It's very
completely lacking in expressiveness, I guess, is what I don't like about it.
Yeah, it's very classical, modern classical. But we'll see. He actually makes he creates paintings that are more expressive as we go on. But going back to Signac now, you can see at this point, Signac has really absorbed the neo-impressionism, though he is, which is what they called it, though he's not doing the dots as rigorously as Seurat. This is quite a wonderful painting, I think, and quite expressive, because it isn't quite as rigorous.
Yeah.
But here he's getting more rigorous, and there's a certain kind of immobility that enters the painting. That's his family.
But this is Signac still.
This is Signac, yes. But Signac really, Signac and Seurat at a certain point almost became, in some ways, they became one artist. They were working so closely together. And Signac was the one who was introducing Seurat to all the other artists and them to him. He introduced Pizarro and Lucien Pizarro, who both became pointillists for a period of time.
See, to me, even though okay.
Well, so Lucien Pizarro here is moving towards pointillism. In this one, I could not find a good example of his pure pointillist painting, but but you can see that he's still, many years later, when he's a painter in England, he's still adhering to that method to some degree, not as extremely as he did for a while. But Pizarro, Camille Pizarro, on the other hand, really took to it in a big way and did some paintings that I think are actually quite good. And I've shown you this one before, but I think it's worth looking at again. In this one, Pizarro manages to actually get a sense of movement and atmosphere quite effectively into this painting with figures. I think it's a wonderful painting and beautifully composed. One of his best figure paintings. And he also do these rural paintings that have a wonderful sense of light to them. And this became a movement. I mean, I'm not going to show you all the others, but a number of painters jumped on the bandwagon because this was seen as being the avant-garde movement, the most radical movement in. Signac, meanwhile, continues. What's interesting to me about this industrial scene is how positive it is and how decorative it is. But this was around the time that he was working. He and Van Gogh became close friends and worked together a lot. And they worked often in this same neighborhood near Assanières, or however you pronounce that word. I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing it right. But this was Van Gogh's take on this kind of industrial landscape. Not anywhere near as positive. But Signac did prevail on him to do some very, some pure pointillist paintings like this one, which I think if you didn't know it, you wouldn't think this was a Van Gogh. And he didn't stay with this very long for the same reason I think that Pizarro would eventually, after 3 or 4 years, abandon it, because he couldn't express himself the way he wanted with this technique. But he takes with him a renewed sense of what can be done with brushstroke and the juxtaposition of color, especially opposites like down here. Because this was a common practice with the pointillists. If they wanted to take an area and cut down the intensity of a color, they would play the opposites in that color, but they would get a vibration out of it, which was analogous to light. I think this is a wonderful painting, done in Paris, quite likely done alongside Signac. And by the way, in checking out Signac further, I learned a couple of things which might interest you. The first of them is that if you remember, there was it was 1888 or nine. I'm not sure if it was 1888 or 1890. A bunch of Van Gogh's paintings was shown at a fairly radical gallery in Brussels called 20, and Lautrec had work there and Signac had work there. And one of the artists in the show said, "I will not show in the same show with these sunflowers." And threw a big fit and requesting that Van Gogh's paintings be thrown out of the show. At which point, as you remember, I think I mentioned Lautrec challenged him to a duel. What I didn't know is that Signac seconded him and said, "You can have a duel with Lautrec, and if it goes badly for Lautrec, I will take you on." So at which point the artist just left the exhibition. But it shows how attached these two artists, Signac and Lautrec, were to Van Gogh and to his work. And further, this Signac, which isn't a particularly distinguished work, this kind of pencil drawing with a little bit of watercolor in it. This is a painting of the garden at the hospital in Arles. He made a special trip down to Arles and spent a day with Van Gogh while Van Gogh was in the hospital after he'd mutilated himself, recovering. And because Signac was there and would act as a chaperone, Van Gogh was allowed to take him back to the Yellow House and they reviewed all the paintings that Van Gogh had done during this period, and clearly had a lasting effect on Signac. And we know that what the general conversation was about, because Signac reported it. He said, we talked about painting, of course, and he filled in Van Gogh on the latest developments with the neo-impressionist movement. He said, we also talked about literature, because Signac, like Van Gogh, was a great reader and also a writer. And we also talked about socialism, which gives a sense of what was going on at this point. Signac had discovered the socialist thinkers, and the anarchist thinkers, and actually was beginning to contribute to journals, the same journals that Camille Pissarro was contributing to. Back to Seurat. Seurat was challenged after the Grandjas. The other painters said, okay, well, you can do some really great things out of doors, but this isn't going to work on the nude. So he took the challenge. And this is one of the studies, a quite lovely study for his next painting. Another study. And actually, he is managing here to get a really pretty good sense of the roundness of form. It led to this painting, which is known as the Models, Les Poseurs. There's a lot of interesting things about this painting. I actually, it's one of my favorite of his paintings.
So those were studies, and this is the final?
This is the final.
Jesus.
Yeah, he was incredibly methodical. Note how in this painting he's put the key model almost exactly in the center of the painting. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, actually, her hands are almost the center of the painting. The center of the painting is right around here. But it's interesting, again, the theory of opposites, I think, is operating here in another way. He's got these nude women with their clothing, because they've just, I think actually, if I remember rightly, and this is not something I read recently, this was the same woman posing for the three figures. But he's got a clothed figure of a woman in the painting by using his Grandjas. So he's got a woman clothed with a parasol and other parasols, and he's got these women nude with a parasol and clothing here of the same color, actually. So he carries these ideas to the extreme. Now he's preparing for his next painting. It's a painting of a band outside of the circus, one of the many circuses in Montmartre, which is there designed to draw people into the circus. Color-wise, this is, to me, the most interesting of all his paintings.
Wow.
One of the, okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit now about the color. See if I'm in the right place here. Sorry. Yeah, the color practice, the basic. We know exactly how they thought, because in 1899, Signac publishes a manifesto, essentially, of neo-impressionism, explaining exactly what it was about. Interestingly enough, the title is From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, and he basically argued that they were expanding on and the ideas of Delacroix around color and the opposites, and just taking it to its logical conclusion and scientific conclusion. Their practice basically was to use, they used pure color broken with white, or grayed a little by putting in a little of the opposite. That was it. They absolutely never used black. They hated gray, and they didn't like brown. They wanted the pure colors of the rainbow, and they wanted them to create all the other colors by close juxtaposition, so the colors would mix in the eye. But if you do transitions of color using this method, you get different transitions than if you mixed colors. And you get some very unusual effects, as you can see across here behind the gentleman on the trombone.
I love this because just for regarding like RGB or just pixels, when you get closer, you sort of, it breaks up. But it's always fascinating. This is obviously before digital, but you could, I mean, love how you can build color and tone just with, like 4 colors, 3 colors.
Yeah, I think they would use more colors than that, but they use them in their pure form just with white.
Yeah, just saying, it's obviously way before digital, but it's fascinating that they achieved the same thing, but more intense. Yeah. Love it.
They also had, apart from what I mentioned about the goldens, the golden proportions, they also had a theory of, well, both Seurat and Signac, of composition, which well, here you can see the dots more closely. You can see what he's doing. When you get up close, it loses its magic, of course. And looking at this on the screen, you're losing some of the intensity of the juxtaposed colors. But you can kind of see how it's constructed and how colors run through one another to create the transitions and the mixed colors.
Wouldn't you say Chuck Close kind of borrowed from this?
Well, in a sort of a way.
But like the way he puts 3 colors together to make a certain part of the face. But like if you look closer, it's like 3 colors make this one color. I feel like Chuck Close kind of.
Yeah. Well, really, this is the point at which modernism takes off with a vengeance, is with pointillism, because there's been an evolution, a really profound evolution. But at this point, until this point, no one had tried to reinvent the whole of painting based on these principles. This is interesting because it's the first painting of the Eiffel Tower. It had actually not even been completed when he painted it. And of course, being a self-described modernist, he loved the Eiffel Tower, whereas most Parisians at that point hated it. So it's significant that he painted this little picture of it. And he continues to do smaller paintings. This is around the area where he did the Grangeat, actually. This, I think, is a quite lovely one and quite atmospheric. But, you had to really plan these paintings because if you wanted to change anything, you couldn't just go in with a brushstroke. You had to go and move all the dots around. It was you really had to plan your composition, and that he was a master at that. You can kind of see it here. Again, on the summers, every summer he would go to the coast and paint pictures like this. So he was also, maybe because his father, the strange family that he came from, well, all families are strange, but the way his father was so private and secretive. This is his mistress, who no one knew about. And he did this painting of her, which he did exhibit, but I don't think they were aware this was his mistress. And she actually had a child. Her name, by the way, was Madeleine Nobloch. So they moved in together and they had an infant. And he now proceeds to do his next to last painting, the Can-Can. You couldn't imagine a more different interpretation of the Can-Can than this compared to Lautrec's paintings. whereas Lautrec's had this gritty, immediate feeling of life in those establishments. This is decorative and but a very entertaining painting. He's also applying the rules around the emotional content of these paintings. Gaiety was supposed to have luminous, warm colors with upward movements. So this is obviously a gay painting in his view. Calm paintings were balanced. There was a balance of light and dark, balance of warm and cool, and horizontal movements. His last summer on the French coast, far north actually. Note that, like the figure in his painting of the nudes, this is exactly in the center. And these bollards actually help to slow down the movement of this line so that it doesn't drag you away. These horizontal notes stabilize the painting. Note that something he did in his drawings, he's doing here. Against the light areas, he runs a little bit of darker blue to accentuate the light on the mast, the light on the lighthouse. These paintings have, to me, a real surrealistic quality, which is partly it's partly a result of the simplification of everything that he does. And it's also the way he reinvents everything. They're intellectual landscapes in a certain way. This is unfinished, the circus. But he's also, again, upward movements, warm colors, and look at the stylization of the hair and the clothing to create these almost flame-like forms, upward rising flame-like forms. Well, he dies before he can finish this painting. He dies at 31. And we don't actually know. He dies at his family home of meningitis or pneumonia or other possible diseases. No one knows. His son dies within a few weeks of the same thing. And his wife, who's pregnant, his mistress, who's pregnant, bears a child, which dies almost immediately. And he just disappears like that. I mean, to the utter shock of the movement, which has got going and now has a number of leading artists and emerging artists involved with it. So Signac becomes the leader of the movement. And for a while works in a manner very similar to Seurat's. It's a little bit simpler. It's not as subtle in its color transitions, stronger contrasts, a little bit more attention to detail, especially in the boats, because this guy loves boats and he spends a huge amount of time sailing. He sails to every port in the Mediterranean and to all the ports along the northern French coast, painting them all. But over a period of a few years, his pointillism begins to, the dots begin to become larger, which is, of course, what Van Gogh did almost immediately. And in a painting like this, you wonder if Van Gogh is in the back of his mind, because of the colors and the movement of the trees and the movement of the brushstrokes, which is becoming a little bit more expressive. The young artists who are coming up, well, Matisse isn't that young. He's he starts later than most of the other artists and takes a while getting up to speed. But Matisse and his partner André Derain um, start practicing pointillism and very quickly move on to this much wilder use of color, which becomes known as fauvism. But it's interesting that Signac, who was personable and who knew all the other artists, was very supportive of the emerging artists. He's now the leader and organizer of the main exhibition, which he started along with Signac and a few other artists. And he encourages all the young artists. He encourages the fauves. In fact, when this is shown, he buys it. And he also will support the emerging cubists. He continues in this manner, which to me becomes very decorative, kind of, and it's almost an orgy of color. But for me, it starts to move so, well, it moves so far away from nature that it, well, some of you may really like it, but I have a problem with it. This is his interpretation of Saint-Tropez, where he purchased a house and lived for a long time before moving on to Antibes. He's actually he's the first radical artist to move to Saint-Tropez, and other artists follow him. And then the same with his moving to Antibes. It's an interesting painting. To me, it's almost too fantastical. What's happening here that I think is very interesting is, you remember the article he wrote on color theory, on neo-impressionist color theory, was titled From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism. And here it seems like he's actually moving towards a new kind of romanticism. And even though he's a contemporary artist and he's a modernist, the subject matter here is really quite traditional. He's what a lot of his work has to do with is memorializing the end of the age of sail, because some of these are painted in, the early 20th century. You still had boats like this in the northern Mediterranean. By the time I was hanging out on the Mediterranean, these boats weren't present anymore, except smaller versions of them in some of the isolated Greek islands. But at this point, most people were still traveling by sail, and most business was still happening that way on the Mediterranean. His brushstroke gets larger, probably under the influence now of the young fauves who are emerging, because this looks like an early fauve painting to me. This is Istanbul on one of his journeys there, with Hagia Sophia in the background here. But it's really fauvism now, not pointillism. This is one of his later paintings, which is quite beautiful, but for my taste, a little excessive. And then I thought I would show you this because it's very interesting. 2 years before his death, he passes through Arles again, and he does a couple of watercolors of what was Van Gogh's Yellow House. It's now pink on this side. Well, the whole of it is pink. And there's now a thriving tabac and bar with outdoor seating. It's, this is 42 years after he visited the Yellow House with Van Gogh. So he's looking back. But you can see that Van Gogh has never left his mind in all these years. And I wonder if he was planning to turn this into a larger painting, because a lot of his larger paintings at this point were based on watercolors done on site, and the big paintings done in his large studio. But you can, I mean, the world in those 42 years, the world had completely changed. 2 years later, he dies at a good age. He was in his 70s. The artistic world has completely changed, and we'll look at that more next time. There's now a flurry of movements, because what happened in the 19th century and the evolution of art from the original revolt of the Romantics through the Barbizon school, through the Realists, through the Impressionists, and then the Neo-Impressionists, was this acceleration of change in art, and this feeling that anything was possible. And all of the more ambitious artists were always seeking some new gimmick, some new way of painting. And this would become the passion in the 20th century. So that's basically what I have to say about pointillism or neo-impressionism.